Excellent. Well, here we are for another Structure 1515, and I'm Andrea Stumpf. We are here to talk about international partnership programs, part of the Balance Basics series, and our topic today is building firm foundations. We do about 15 minutes, I'm afraid maybe a little bit longer today on presentation where I go through some slides, and then we'll have time for conversation after that, and we'll go another 15 or longer, depending on what you all have time and appetite for. So because I've overdone it on content again, let me plunge right in and see how timely it can be. I'll keep an eye on the clock, and we'll just go right into the topic. All right, so I'd like to start by just mentioning that I have these two books out there, The Primer for Partners and A Book for Builders, and those are where most of the content comes from here, although we are building on it, so there's more here. But if you like what we're discussing here, if it's helpful, then I'm sure these books will be a good resource for you, and they're both available on Amazon. And I also like to start by just saying what the whole point of the exercise is. So whether it's the books or the Structure 1515, all of this is really about answering the question, do you know where you are in the landscape? And the idea, of course, is that if you can see the landscape and if you can see yourself in the landscape, then you can see the options and make better choices. So for today, the landscape we're in is the international arena, and the specific topic, the focus, is on international partnership programs. Although I think just about everything we're going to say today applies to partnerships generally, and maybe even to life in general. But just a quick definition of partnership programs. We'll start in the international arena. So that means governments or multilateral organizations, international organizations. But the definition that I've given to this modality, just to be able to lift it out and really study it, is to describe it as a hybrid. It's a combination of the old and the new. What we take is a partnership that's coming together through a governing body, and that's a kind of new dedicated partnership component, but we attach it or we link it to a supporting entity, and that supporting entity is an existing entity. So it's this old and new combination that really is the definitional piece of international partnership programs. And that's it. It's really these two elements. And then you have one of these partnership programs. Now, in reality, these partnership programs usually need some additional funding, either to implement their activities or to just run their partnership. So very often it's these three components: the governing body, the supporting entity, and a funding vehicle like an international trust fund, two of which are, of course, new and dedicated partnerships components, all supported by one or more supporting entities. All right, so here we are in the Balance Basics series. We're midway through, and we're talking about firm foundations today. And it's maybe just worth pointing out the last couple of months, we talked about critical mass and center of gravity. Those were kind of action-oriented, what I refer to as the physics. And we're now moving on to foundations and buttresses. So that's really a little more in the structural piece, the edifice, the architecture of things. So today we're going to be on foundations. And when we think about foundation, I don't know about you, but the first thing that comes to my mind is the old Bible story that Matthew tells us that if you build on rock, the wise man had a lot more success than the foolish man who built on sand, because his house fell, and great was the fall of it, which of course we don't want to have happen to our partnership programs. But if it were only so easy, right? But nothing is that straightforward. So as a matter of fact, even though the parable is useful in a partnership program context, when you're building your partnership, it's really important to be contextual. And we may actually find that sand could even in some cases be helpful, like if we're in an earthquake zone, or maybe that's all we have. Maybe there is no other way to, other place to build the partnership. We're in a fragile conflict, violent setting, and we just have to build it where we are. So maybe sand is even an essential element that we have to work with foundationally. In any case, the point is that in trying to be contextual, we do have choices about foundations in our partnership programs. And it is worth really thinking about what we're doing from a foundational perspective. So of course, rock is a really good way to go. And the way I usually like to think about it, though, is not so much that it's just the rock, but it's the rock in combination with water. So we want that stability, but it's also helpful to build it in a way that it has some flexibility built in. And you'll see on a later slide, I'll talk about it in the context of center of gravity, how that plays out. But in your particular case, you may also find that there's more going on, and maybe you need some wheels. Thinking of, for example, partnership programs that are incremental, that may grow through different phases. Or maybe you have a pilot project that you want to scale, or you want to be able to apply from one region to another or one sector to another, make it somewhat transferable. So maybe you need some wheels to your partnership, but of course that gets more complex. And as you get more complex, you want to think about what else do I need to do foundationally? So maybe you need some training wheels. Now we're starting to talk about buttresses, which is what we're going to do next month. And maybe it's the kind of thing where you actually could use a driver's license. There's also the kind of out of the box approach. I have definitely seen one or the other partnership that was more of a wall fastener type foundation, but that can be a precarious model. I'm thinking of, for example, you have a champion donor and you start with your wall fastener, and then a year or two later, your champion donor decides that they actually have other priorities. So that single pivot point might need some other things to be sufficiently foundational. Most important, though, is that we avoid the quicksand, right? We don't want to get stuck. We don't want to get stagnant or even start to sink. But here it's worth noting that quicksand can be very hard to spot in advance. So the main point is to say it is worth being deliberate and thoughtful about the foundations that you build for your partnership programs. And of course, contextual foundations are nothing new. Perhaps you're familiar with that very famous example from Frank Lloyd Wright, Falling Water, where he was bold enough, or maybe had the audacity, to build right on top of the river, basically over the falls. And if you think about it, you might even be able to remember a partnership or two that tried to do just that. There's also this nice example I found about the Green Doe, which is houses, apartments built into a mountainside. Makes me think of the one-stop shop, full service international partnership platforms that we have. So in thinking about building the foundation for your partnership program, it's really helpful to recognize that there are different tools and techniques, basically your building materials that you want to use for your partnering, that can fortify your foundation. And so here I'd like to share three that are kind of very common or obvious ones. And maybe in the conversation, we'll come up with some other building materials. But here's some tools and techniques that I have in mind that are very important when building partnership foundations. So the first one is structure. That's a pretty basic one. But in this environment, it's worth noting that structure for these international partnership programs basically means entities, legal entities like government agencies, international organizations, multilateral organizations. And the structure involves the relationships among them, how they're connected, how the roles and responsibilities are allocated. My favorite example here, no surprise, will be the supporting entity, and to talk about that role, which we'll do in a moment. But it's also worth recognizing that design can be a foundational element. So I'm talking about processes and procedures. And my example here will be consensus decision-making as a really foundational piece to creating your international partnership program. And especially for lawyers, but really for everyone, documents are a very, very important part of building a foundation for international partnership programs. And it's not just to reflect the agreed terms, but also to to build them, to create the common understanding, and to confirm the common understanding. And my very, very favorite example here is adopted charters. So let me say a few words about each of these just in the time that we have. When we're talking about the supporting entity, there's so many different ways in which we can talk about how it can be foundational. But if you look at the cover photo of my primer, it was not by happenstance that I chose a very large, broad, flat rock to be able to build the other partnering pieces on top of it. So supporting entities can have that kind of effect for an international partnership program by creating that broad, sturdy base. And there's a lot in my primer, a couple of chapters on this. But what's really worth seeing here is that if we go back to the definition at the beginning of the slides and this combination of new and old, the supporting entity is actually that older piece. It's half of that equation. And it's, I think, one of the things that makes these international partnership programs so attractive. Because what we're actually doing is we're creating stability for that governing body, for that partnership component, to have a really solid basis through the supporting entity support. And what works especially well is if that supporting entity comes in as a partner with the same kinds of missions and mandate and goals, as opposed to just being an outsourced entity or a service relationship. So this is very different from talking about, say, a free-floating partnership, where you might not have a supporting entity, and in the end, and maybe it's just a network, something that doesn't need that, but you are much more subject to the vagaries that way. It's also very different from setting up a partnership that is done from scratch, where you're creating the partnership in the context of a new legal entity. And that would be, for example, the Gavi or global funds of the world, the EITI, Green Climate Fund. There's some other examples of this. That is a much heavier lift. And for many of these partnerships, this hybrid new and old, which allows the partnership to have some strong anchoring, is actually a very good fit. Also talked about consensus decision-making as being a very foundational element. So when we're talking about process and procedures, design elements. Here, the key, of course, is that we are in an environment where we don't get splits and we don't get splinters, which is to say that if you're in a voting environment, if the vote is not by consent, if it's not a consensus decision and you end up with minority views or even dissenting blocks, that can be fairly disruptive over time. And consensus in that sense can really be a strong foundational piece that allows the foundation to stay firm over time. And in fact, we talked about in our last series, the number 7 of series 1 was all about consensus decisions and why they're so helpful in this environment. And now a moment on charters. So taking the agreement approach to building foundation. What I love about these adopted charters is that it doesn't just provide the durability, it also enables the flexibility. And we don't have enough time to really say everything there is to say about this here, but noting that charters are by definition meant to be fundamental. They are about the fundaments of the partnership as fundamentally understood. And of course, foundation and fundament have that same Latin root, which is fundare, to lay a basis for. And we could talk quite a bit about what makes charters so wonderful. I have this list of 11 things in the book for builders, but also the entire middle section, so a third of my book for builders, is called charterography, and I include an annotated model charter. So all the different ways that we can think about charters in the context of building stability and maintaining that foundation over time. All right, so I have one more slide here that is on the content side of things. This is, I guess I'm going to call this the bonus slide. Bonus in the sense that I know we're essentially out of time, but I do want to take a moment to connect the dots and to show how last month's topic on center of gravity fits with what we're talking about today, foundation, and to play out these themes in a little more detail. So we have 4 boxes here, 4 different scenarios. And if you take the black line at the bottom and you treat that, think of that as the foundation of the partnership program. And then this red dot in the middle is really your center of gravity. And let's look at how center of gravity and foundation actually work together through these 4 scenarios. And maybe intuitively just think about, what do you think would be the best version if you were trying to set up your partnership program? Which of these 4 would be your ideal scenario? So let's talk about them. In the first scenario, we're looking at something that's actually pretty good, right? It's very solid. It's just a box on a very stable plane, and it's sitting there, and it's hard to imagine something that is more stable, more solid. Except that it is so stable and static that it may actually be too stable, particularly in an international partnership program context, because while it is really good at the beginning, it may not be what you need over time. And that's again because we need to be contextual, and the context is going to change. So you need to have a way to have some kind of flexibility in your partnership so it can change over time. So we can certainly think of partnership programs that have become too comfortable, that are not adapting to their environment and kind of become outdated or no longer relevant, or even partnerships that are over dependent, like it is possible to be too dependent on your supporting entity and to lose the partnership aspects of it. But if we think about a slightly different scenario by which the partnership has a little bit of resilience built into it, that's our example 2. We have stability, but resilience in the sense that even when the boat gets rocked a bit, when there's an external or internal change to the partnership, the center of gravity, and here's the key element, is still within the foundation, so that the movement happens, but the partnership is still able to right itself like a boat with its ballast and still be good over time. And that's the value of, say, the charter or having a good relationship with your supporting entity, because it is actually going to create that resilience, which allows for change even within the context of stability. Now, it is possible to have a situation where you're kind of stable, or at least you're balanced, but precarious in the sense that you are just at that point where basically you're, barely making things work. And I'm thinking of partnership programs that end up spending so much time dealing with themselves and managing their own partnership environment that they're really not even able to do the work that they set out to do. So they're almost looking too much internal and not doing the results work and getting the outcomes that they were hoping to achieve. In these cases, I think we're talking often about a lack of foundation. There's just not enough of a basis for everything to cohere. And maybe that's a lacking consensus. So again, consensus being very important in being able to maintain this kind of stability and balance over time. And naturally, where we don't want to end up is in that failed partnership where we get so far off that we're in that unstable environment and hit that tipping point where it's really just a matter of time. And what you can see, especially comparing 2 and 4, is that here we have a situation where the center of gravity is outside the scope of the foundation. And so when that change comes, when that movement, when the boat is rocked, happens, then it's not that you fall back into a zone of resilience, but you end up tipping over. So maybe the partnership is overextended, or maybe it's out of sync with what the partners want or what's happening at the time. So you have these 4 scenarios, and I've spent quite a bit of time on them, but I think it's helpful to see that some are better than others. And in fact, if I were to put my vote in there, I would say number 2 is actually the best version for international partnership programs, because you have a broad enough base, so a sufficient foundation for the range of motion that you need to be able to accommodate relative to where your center of gravity is. And that's an analysis that you can really do partnership by partnership. And if you realize that you need a broader base to manage the kind of shifts or complexities that are in your partnership environment, then you want to think about ways to increase that foundational basis. All right, so I will just finish with my partnering to go. And that's a quote from my book. This time we're in my book for builders. Partners can find balance in their sweet spot. That's what we talked about in November. Their critical mass, that was our topic in December. Their center of gravity, which we did last month. But those alone are not enough. They need to build on them. They need to add enough infrastructure to create stability. So what creates this kind of stability? A firm foundation that we've been talking about today, with buttressing in the wings, that's our topic for next month, and a bunch of glue, substructural pillars, a wide roof to protect from the elements, and even a lightning rod to subdue the storm surge are among the features that come to mind. So lots of metaphor, but hopefully enough to stimulate your thoughts about how to build very strong partnership foundations. And thank you. We are now ready for some conversation. So let me pull out of this screen share and get back to the group. All right, thank you everyone for joining. And I see Paul, you're on board as well. So thanks for coming to the group. The floor is open. Paul, I don't know if you want to say something in the beginning, since I know your time may be short, but we are I'm very interested to hear your thoughts, and hopefully it stimulated a few ideas. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Andrea. And yeah, sorry for coming in first, but I will have to drop at 12:30, but I'm glad I made it, because this is actually interesting and thought-provoking for me in one particular engagement that I'll sort of talk about briefly, that I think gives a good example. So I'm thinking of one partnership here at the bank that I work on that's a financial intermediary fund, right? And the best, I think one of the best examples of the need for finding the right sort of intersection between stability and flexibility has been COVID, right? That everybody's had, no matter what your sector, you've had to probably react somehow, even if it wasn't obvious in your work program, because your partners are coming to the table with that in mind, whether that's purely a resource issue, or whether that's because their own programs are changing and they want to see change in the program. So I think this particular partnership was a good example of where the foundation, the fact that it was connected right to the bank as the supporting organization, and the way that the governing documents had been right-sized, so to speak, right, allowed there to be enough dynamism and flexibility to kind of take some of that on. Maybe not as quickly as they would have wanted to, but at least it was there, and it didn't require open heart surgery to make some adjustments, right? And you can think of other models where the parameters would have been a little bit more locked in for whatever historical reasons or whatnot, or because there was a clear understanding of what somebody wanted at the time, and that would have been much more difficult, I think, for the partnership to adjust, because they said, we're actually going to we are doing only ABC, right? And you don't want it too open-ended, but the more prescriptive it is, right, the harder it can be to change. It's also interesting because there's a restructuring kicking off, and one of the things that's on the table is, while kind of the foundational structure might stay the same, in order to attract more, I feel like there's a sense from some quarters that in order to attract more partners and more funding, we have to make more specific commitments. And the more specific you make those commitments, and the more that you put them directly into your design, so to speak, then the next time it seems to me it would be that much harder to do what you just did, which was actually adapt. So I'm living this tension right now and sort of trying to caution in some of those areas that, you know, there are different ways to do things. You know, you can have, I suppose, you know, goals and targets that you don't have to, you know, make hardwired governance elements, right? That, you know, finding the right, I guess the right way to put it is, you know, finding the right level that you just described, you know, among the levels that you just described, to insert, you know, certain parameters is going to dictate how easy it is to make adjustments in the future. So anyway, I thought that was very interesting and very timely for me to think about. So as always, thanks. This was very, very, very interesting and thought-provoking.
Oh, thank you, Paul. And I have to surmise that no matter what I put on the screen will be timely for you because all these topics do play out, I think, in real life, like constantly in different ways. And they're all related to each other, of course. But I hadn't actually thought about COVID specifically. And you're so absolutely right. That is maybe the poster child for the need to be able to adjust and be flexible within that resilience zone, you know, so that your partnership stays standing or, you know, falls on its feet. So that's actually fantastic as a way to tee off the discussion. I mean, and I'm happy to lend you some of these slides as well in case it helps your partners visualize some of what this tension is about and different places they can go with it. Not to do too much with the analogies, I do want to make sure that in the conversation we can also be very concrete. So I'm just going to mention something that plays into finding that right balance of, you know, what has to be committed and more restricted is another way to put it from a lawyer's perspective, is more non-negotiable versus things that are more negotiable or at least flexible over time. And one of those things that I try to tease out in the book for builders is to talk about the value, the difference between signed agreements, particularly fund flow agreements. So the contribution agreements that donors sign coming into the partnership, into the trust fund, as compared to an adopted charter, an adopted document, whatever you call it. But the fact that it's adopted means that it's the governing body that owns that collectively, as opposed to bilateral signatures between a donor and a trustee. And of course, there are many of those bilateral agreements. Cumulatively, there's a collective effect, but it's still all these signed agreements. What is really interesting as a lawyer, even from a business perspective, is to play with that. So in my Like Rock, Like Water discussion, and we did this in the first session for Structure 1515, if you put something in the agreement, like your donor agreement, your contribution agreement, you're essentially signaling that that's less negotiable. Like, we don't expect that to change. The trustee terms are pretty standardized, and you're buying into that if you're going to open up a trust fund here with us as the supporting entity, versus say mission or activities or allocation of roles and responsibilities or membership rules, things that might need tweaking or maybe even need an overhaul, where you know you want the room for change and you don't mind if the governing body owns it, because that's a very efficient way to go. So part of a lawyer's job here is to help navigate those two modalities. You can have more fixed terms within the range of what you need and not jeopardizing your partnership over time in signed agreements, but you use the charter, this adopted document that the governing body can work with, as that margin for flexibility and adjustability and resilience. And of course, very key to all of this, and again, I have a whole chapter on alignment, is they have to talk to each other. So that charter has to be embedded into the contribution agreements, and the contribution agreements have to recognize the charter so that it's all part of a package and can create a very stable structure, you know, sinews and nuts and bolts and all connected together. I think I spoke long enough for Paul to have to leave, but thank you for that contribution. All right.
Which was a great contribution. Let me just dive in here. And I love your use of images, and I thought that they were really powerful in this. And I also learned a little bit about architecture, which,
Good.
well, the base is, very low. So it's a large percentage increase in learning. I know about flying buttresses, but that's from art history. It did make me think that wall fastener image is actually very powerful, because it made me think it's extremely susceptible to forces that other kinds of fastenings might not be. So gravity being a potentially counteracting force. When you've got a foundation on the ground, gravity is kind of your friend. But when it's hanging from the ceiling or hanging from the wall, then it's definitely something to watch out for. So in case you wanted to take that image to the next level and you hadn't already thought of that.
No, I really like that. And actually saying that gravity on the ground, if you have a foundation on the ground, is your friend, that's actually really helpful, where it's still the same center of gravity, maybe the same force, but depending on how you create the foundation, it can either work for you or work against you.
And it can bring you back, right?
Yeah.
If you get out of equilibrium, you can come back.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to say also that I love the idea of charterography. That's if that isn't a word, it really, really should be. Consensus decision making. That's my personal go-to. I really like it. And not only did we use it in the partnership that I was managing at the bank, but we kind of applied it without talking with people first in a partnership that I'm involved with now. And it was amazing how the committee, which was a decision-making body, but didn't really know that it was, because it's still youthful, they adopted it right away. They loved the idea of consensus decision-making. It was
Great.
it was naturally appealing. And I think there is very strong power in it.
Yeah.
And my that your preferred model is the one that is resilient to dynamic situations, to being able to change the structure in response to the situation. And a couple of examples came to my mind. One is the partnership I was managing at the bank, where the change was to change the relationship of one important set of stakeholders to the partnership, to allow them access to funding that they had not had before. And that was a real challenge for the partnership. There was a lot of resistance, some passive, some very active. Then more recently, and I'm hoping that you and I are going to be able to follow up on this conversation, is actually changing the supporting entity, shifting from one supporting entity to another. And with a very small supporting secretariat, that could be a really easy thing to do, or it could be hugely challenging. So I'd welcome, because key person risk gets magnified in those sorts of situations. So I'd really welcome your thoughts on that. Thanks for letting me go on for a bit too long there. Thank you.
No, not at all. Definitely. Thanks, Nicola. And Jean, I know you're ready to say something, so why don't you speak before I weigh in?
I just had a question. Where within the phases of building these partnerships do conversations about integrity fall? Because in many ways, I see that as an incredibly important part of the foundation building, whether it's reaching across the governing bodies or the supporting entities or the trust fund. There's got to be some sort of guardrail protective conversation. And I do a ton of work these days with anti-corruption advocacy, and this is a topic that just gets assumed. We want to think that everything's on the up and up, and we want to assume that everybody's on board. So I was just curious, where do you weave in that component?
Yeah, okay, great question. And you gave I was going to ask you, what do you mean by integrity? But you've mentioned anti-corruption, so that's clearly part of what you're thinking of.
Especially with money,
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, so from a money perspective, and of course, I often am at pains to encourage people not to look at the money because they lose sight of the partnership aspects. Like if you're looking at the trust fund so much and it's all about the money, you kind of lose the partnership and the governance piece of it. But I like what you're asking, because that really emphasizes again the importance of, even when you're looking at the money, it's very important to have a partnership perspective on what that money is there for. To Nicola's point a little bit, who's providing it? Is this within the zone of acceptability? You know, do we like who our donors are? Are they all properly motivated? Are we really in a like-minded space? We're not doing any whitewashing here. You know, we could use some other terms perhaps to describe the common dynamics in this environment, but particularly too, is our fiduciary structure that we're setting up for this an appropriate one for where the partners are? So do we have the right level of robustness in terms of the operating framework, the supervision that is needed to be able to manage the propensity or the possibility of corruption or any kind of, you know, misuse of funding? So I would first say that the choice of trustee is very important, but that of course points to the supporting entity, where the choice of the supporting entity determines what that operating framework is very often, if you're relying on the trustee's operating framework. So that's a piece of it. But I think the even bigger piece, Jean, and this fits in with what I was saying about building the foundation, is the ability to come to a common understanding and to test that through common articulation. And that's where the charter comes in. And that is an exercise that can happen at any time, but ideally would happen at the beginning of the partnership as you're establishing it. And even the way most of these work is that you establish the partnership through the charter. There's a kind of chicken and egg thing going on. But it's in the process of developing the charter that partners are able to determine, are we really a good fit? Are we made for each other? Do we all have the same definition of what we think matters? What are the main elements? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes setting out with the intention of having those conversations and yeah, and it opens up a lot of vulnerability to people sometimes because they're cautious or they're trying to, you know, in a new relationship.
Sure.
You know, it's like, you don't talk about politics, money, or religion, right? You know, and here we are kind of going, ugh. But the failure to do that, and if something happens that breaks trust, that it's so much harder to rebuild and kind of move forward from a crack in the foundation, if you will.
Yeah, I talk a lot about these partnership programs being voluntary exercises, right? Nobody's obligated to participate. And even once you've started, you don't necessarily have to continue. So you want to make sure you maintain interest, but you more than anything want to make sure that you're doing what the partners intend to do, that the sum of the parts, the whole that you're creating, which is greater than the sum of the parts, is actually moving in the direction that the partners want. And so from that perspective, it becomes really important to be able to make sure that you're in a sufficiently like-minded space for that consensus to evolve, for the partnership to be able to move forward and keep everyone on board, you know, that voluntary element again. So building the trust, I actually think of charters as a way to build the trust, you know, to build it, to confirm it as you're building it, but also you're testing on those sometimes difficult topics, but it's on the key topics that are going to matter, not just today, but a year from now, 2 years from now, whenever. And much better to find out now that maybe there was a disconnect or find ways to manage or mitigate some of those differences than to figure it out after things have been going on for a while and then there's much more at stake. Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I have had amazing experiences working with partners to develop their charters in ways that they then really could say they owned it. They knew what was in the document. It was plain English. They had, you know, created it for themselves. And that created a foundational basis because there was so much buy-in. And it also opened the door to making the adjustments that, you know, you're talking about, Nicola, and also I'm sure that Paul was working with to be able to make those adjustments because the governing body owns it. They'll want to keep it current. Tazeen, I see that your hand's up, so maybe let me let you talk and then I'll react a bit to what Nicola was saying as well.
Okay, thank you. I have very little experience in this area, and well, I want to know more, but I have a question.
Please,
And it
yeah.
has to do with the distinction, because sometimes, especially when you don't have an expert working to set up, it's possible to fall into the problem of being too static in setting up, and it's not resilient enough. Now, what are the tips that can be employed to prevent that? Because already when you fall into something very rigid, it might be difficult to actually be able to work with that, especially when uncertainty like COVID happens. So what are the tips that could help to watch out for while building such to make it as flexible as possible, at the same time being practicable that it could actually deliver? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's great because that's actually one of the key questions that I try to flesh out, to first make people see the value of having the stability and the flexibility, and then talk about exactly where that balance is and what your tools are to do the stability, but also to do the flexibility. So I have a chapter in my book, the very first chapter of the very first book is called Like Rock, Like Water. And I put it up front because I have exactly this theme in mind, that you want the flexibility built in directly into the stability and directly from the start. And there are probably many ways to do it, but if you think about it structurally, and as a lawyer, I think about it a lot in terms of documents. Some of it is what I just described when responding to Paul, reacting to his comment, which is the intersection or the interplay between the signed agreements, and you always have those when you have fund flows, along with these other adopted kind of documents. It doesn't even have to be a charter. You can, a year later, decide, to Jean's point, that you need a code of conduct for private sector participation because you've realized, wow, that's a bit of a sensitive point. Let's add to our commonly agreed documents and we'll approve a code of conduct, and we'll use the governing body to do that. So it'll belong to the partnership, and it gives us a chance to be flexible in a way that we've created a new document with some more common ground, but it's also approved with one single decision point. It's not a whole bunch of signatures that can take a year or however long. It's just, put it on the table, have a discussion. It might take months to get it ready, but it's one decision point to get it approved, and we all know we're done. Or it's one decision point to get it amended. So this is kind of the document view of how the flexibility can be built in. We can talk about some other things, but that's a big one for me, and one that plays through a lot of the documents. A lot of the presentations and themes that come up in this environment. So I hope that's helpful. And
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. So I do think you said a number of things, Nicola, and I think this gravity idea that, gravity being your friend, gravity in some ways in that context is actually reality. And it's interesting to me that when partnerships begin, it's kind of the nuptials, everybody's very happy, we're all hunky-dory. And it's very tempting to kind of gloss over where some of the differences may be. But even here, there's a balance, because you don't want to do too deep and scare everyone away, because there's certainly room for differences of motivations and differences of views. But you want to go deep enough that Jean, I think it's really important what you said, that you're building the level of trust that will sustain you going forward. And gravity being reality, it's impossible to tell what's going to come in the future. And COVID is an example, but we can think of many more examples. So in a way, we have to be positioned with enough trust that any number of things can, come through real life that will still need some managing, adapting, accommodating.
You know, and particularly as you mentioned, being aware of the source of money and whether it's coming from a zone of acceptability.
Right.
Holy cow. Sometimes, you know, I really do wish I could go, you know, I want plausible deniability. I'm not gonna, you know, but it just makes you realize that there's so many more components to all of this than the money in a pot. You know, that it's a very important trust building, foundation building. So thank you very much for today. It was great.
Well, and actually, let me just throw in the concept of risk here, because, you know, doing the integrity analysis is partly doing a risk analysis, and you're doing the analysis based on not just the risk of, do we have what we need to make the partnership work? Can we get the results that we want? But are we associating with the partners that we feel comfortable associating with? And part of what's going on there is actually brand. And brand I describe as a collective. We come together under one brand. And why do we have these acronym names? Because they're very easy to say and they're very easy to brand, right? Except for GAFSP, which would be Nicola's, right? So that one maybe wasn't so easy to say. But, you know, Gavi and Global Fund just dropped off, you know, 4 of its last words in its name. It's just the Global Fund, or EITI. You know, it's very simple to just say the acronym, but the value is in the brand. The minute we apply a brand, and there's lots more on this in my book, the minute we apply the brand, everyone is associated to everything, because the brand is this ultimate collectivizer. And so, you know, I may not really be thinking about the other donors coming into this fund. And mostly that's fine, because mostly we don't have any issues. But if there is an issue and we're all connected through this brand, then it may be an associational risk, reputational risk. And it could be the kind of risk that's not just reputational, it can actually tank your partnership. So it may be operational, you know, it may have that kind of an effect. So this question of integrity and building trust, you know, has to do with the ability of the partnership to be operationally sustainable over time, and, you know, keep everyone board and function in a way that the partners can believe in, you know, intend. Nicola, please, your hands up.
Yeah, because I did want to come back to the question that I put to you, and I think it belongs in this segment of the discussion because it's about risk and fitting the ideas of risk into the framework that you described. Because I'm thinking of a young partnership that has an overextended secretariat, and at the same time we're looking at shifting supporting entities. And there's not that most stakeholders in this are really welcoming the change, but not everybody is. And so it has led me to think about key person risk. And especially given that there's a small number, it seems to me that risk is magnified. So using your framework, I'd just love to hear your perspectives on that and how to manage that.
Actually, I meant to say a little bit more.
Key person risk.
Yeah, I meant to say a little bit more because you raised this question of supporting entity, and particularly a scenario where you're shifting from one to another. So I do usually tell people that what we call spin-offs, when you're moving from one legal entity, one supporting entity to another, can be one of the hardest things to do. And it happens on so many dimensions that it can be very, very complex. But I've done them and they're not impossible and they take some work, but I've seen it done in at least one case where it was very helpful and very effective. And it is sometimes a sign of a maturing and growing partnership. And I've also seen, you know, partnership environments. So let's take the Green Climate Fund, where there's kind of a transitional initial trustee, and then they make decisions over time as to how to stabilize it. But what makes a big difference in these environments, so this is a little bit outside of the foundational question, but one of the pieces, and I talk about this a lot as well, is how modular you are in your perspective. And what that means is how clear are you about where the roles and responsibilities are? And have you delineated the kind of role that this secretariat or this supporting entity is playing so that you can say, first of all, how does it distinguish from other roles which are not changing? And within this context, which of the roles are we switching so that you know what box you're moving at that time? So the modularity is a really important element to ease this kind of transition. And the way you get modularity is you have to articulate the roles and responsibilities. And what is that? That is articulating the delineations and the connections. So when I talk to people about relationships in this environment, you can think about it in life as well. It's connections are not just, relationships are not just about connections. What you have to do before you do the connection is you have to delineate. You can only connect what you have actually defined as being separate. So the first step to relationships, the first step to connecting is to first draw the lines and delineate. So in these partnership programs, which are totally sui generis, and it's as you define them, it's good to know this is my supporting entity, this is my secretariat, my trustee piece, this is what they're doing, delineate it. Then you can do all sorts of things. You can draw the connections, you can make changes, you can shift the whole thing over and do your spin-off. But it takes a little bit of discipline to actually try to spell some of that out. Sorry, I have a wandering cat. We just started fostering cats in the house, so this is new for us. Anyhow, so that's a few words on spin-offs. Yeah.
That's great. Actually, as we go into the conversation, you'll see why I looked a bit surprised when you mentioned spin-offs, because the situation that we find ourselves in is actually different from the World Bank context of spin-offs. It's, for me, it's much more of a, okay, here was our foundation and we're gonna pick the house up and we're gonna put it here now.
So you're doing the whole house.
Lock, stock, and barrel. Yeah. So we can talk more about it.
Yeah, so I think it's.
But I think you're spot on when you're talking about carefully delineating the roles and responsibilities is extremely important, especially at this stage. I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah. And building that common ground around what it is you're talking about. So not just delineating them, you know, for the people who are in the know, but delineating it in a way that the partnership is galvanizing around and is on board with understanding what those delineations and connections are.
Yeah. Part we have, but there is that sense sometimes of everybody has to be clear on the overall objective, the overall mission.
Yeah. Very much.
Because without that, and I don't know where in the architectural framework that comes right now, but I guess it's linked to the center of gravity.
We have so many concepts, it's a little hard to tell where we are.
Oh, it's great. It's great. And physics and architecture, because architecture depends on physics. I really find these images very useful. And I must go. Thank you so much. It's been terrific as always. And I'm looking forward to the next one.
Thank you. Thank you. And we're at the hour. So let me just say thank you to everyone. And we'll meet again in a month, I hope, and talk about buttresses and keep building out the platform here. So thank you to all of you and take care. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.